Hi, this is Steve Barsh, Chief Innovation Officer of DreamIt, and welcome to our panel today on how to pilot healthcare solutions. Thanks for tuning in. Some of you will be live, some of you will be watching this recorded. I just wanted to quickly, we'll go around and introduce who our panelists are. I'm going to tell you who they are quickly. Todd Dunn is with us from Intermountain Health in Salt Lake City. Roy Rosen is with us from Penn Medicine, Chief Innovation Officer at Penn Medicine, and Eric Stager is with us from Independence Blue Cross. Two people, three of us actually, physically in Philadelphia, one in Salt Lake City. The objective of today's panel, we find across the board that early stage digital health companies really don't understand how to run effective trials within healthcare systems and how to pilot and make them as successful and smooth as possible so you can achieve success. So we wanted to go through today and talk about the tricks and traps of doing pilots successfully, pragmatics, lessons learned from some of the best in the business. So thanks for joining us, gentlemen, today. If we could go around, by the way, I have my screen right now set in gallery mode if you're watching live. It might be best to set it in gallery mode if you're watching this live on Zoom. If we could go around and we'll start actually with Roy, if you just don't mind, introduce yourself and give us about a minute about your background and what you do, please.
Sure. Roy Rosen, Chief Innovation Officer, Penn Medicine. So I've been here for about 4 years now. I have worked with maybe 40 or 50 startups in this setting at this point. My life prior to Penn was building technology businesses. Spent about 19 years with Intuit, Quicken being my first product, and then working on building the innovation programs there and building lots of new technology approaches to the market. And it's been a real blast working with DreamIt and bringing companies in here, and also working with other systems. I've had a chance to collaborate on several things with Todd, and Todd can introduce himself, but in seeing some of the companies get out to Intermountain as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Eric, with Independence Blue Cross, can you give a quick intro and what you do? It would be great.
Sure, sure, Steve. Eric Stager from Independence Blue Cross. I'm now upside down on the...
Sorry about that.
That's awesome.
Flipping that iPad around. I don't know why it just flipped on you.
So I co-manage our strategic innovation portfolio, which is a long-winded way of saying it's our corporate venture arm. We've also been one of the starting founders for the DreamIt Health Cycle, so been involved in selecting and working with startups for almost 4 years now. I've been at IBC for 4 years, and prior to that, spent close to a decade in venture capital and local VC firms in Philadelphia.
Cool. Awesome. Yes, and Penn Medicine, and by the way, I don't know why your image is turned upside down, but I'm sure we're going to fix it in a minute. Oh, that's even. There we go. Thought it was the Poseidon Adventure or something, and the building flipped upside down. Anyway, and yes, Penn Medicine and Independence Blue Cross are big sponsors of DreamIt Health in Philadelphia, and we greatly appreciate that, and thank you. Also on the webinar today, we have Todd Dunn from Intermountain Health in Salt Lake City. Thanks for joining us a little early this morning. Todd, if you could briefly introduce yourself and talk about what you do and a little on your background.
Yeah, I'm the Director of Innovation for Intermountain Healthcare. I've been here a little over 3 years. Before that, I've worked for GE and Cisco, McKesson, a few big firms. Roy and I have actually been partners in crime around this innovation dialogue for about 7 years now. And one of my key roles in this job is searching out and piloting with early stage healthcare companies, and have had the fortune of working with a few of them out of the DreamIt program.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Can we let's just build from there. I think it would be helpful for people listening in to get a feel for how many all of you have touched. In the last couple of years, maybe Todd, you could start because you're just commenting on it. How many trials, whether it's been a full trial running in Intermountain, but how many, just to give the audience kind of a view, how many trials have you touched or run in the last couple of years in your career?
Definitely north of 10.
Okay.
But it took, I've probably reviewed over 150 early stage companies. Conservatively, I would say that's how many have looked at or have reached out to us.
Wow. Okay. So 150, and if you said 200, it would be like, wow, it's 5%, somewhere between 5 and 10%. I didn't even think of that, but interesting. Okay. So about 10 that you've run in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Okay, Roy, for you at Penn Medicine, just to give people a feel for where you're coming from, how many of you have been involved in running either your internal ideas maybe or external?
I would say we've done probably about 40 or 50 pilots.
Wow.
I would say that from the internal, from the external companies coming in, I think the conversion rate is similar to Todd's. We probably looked at a couple hundred, and of those 40 or 50, maybe a couple dozen were external companies, and so similar conversion rate.
Okay, interesting. In Eric, for what you're doing at Independence Blue Cross, I know, and you've been a speaker many times at Dream It over the years about, and we're going to pull the ideas from you today on running successfully pilots and trials. How many companies have either been involved in funding the trial, involved in running it, or advising them on, oh, so you want to do an early stage digital health trial?
Yeah, so I was going through the numbers in the back of my mind, probably 4 or 5 that we've done pilots with, generally 1 or 2 from each of the Dream It classes, and then a handful. Generally, before we make an investment in a company, we will look to pilot and or prove them out. So we have a portfolio of 6 companies. We piloted 2 or 3 of them, or using them as a vendor at a time. And similar to both Todd and Roy, we generally try to look at 100 to 150 companies for investment each year. Unlike Roy, where we don't have a lot of internally generated ideas, so they're all external companies. And then my job is to find a business unit that has an interest in using those companies and what their ROI would be, and how can I get a business unit excited about this new technology and this new company.
Interesting. Okay, interesting. So, I mean, people with tons of experience, a lot of experience evaluating things. It's interesting to hear. Certainly not everything that comes through the door winds up in a trial and pilot. If we build on that, what would you say are some of the, and anyone can answer this, what are some of the key items you think a startup needs to have in place and nailed down before coming to you about a pilot? If you had a magic wand, you could say, please have these things in place before you come to us for a pilot. Any one of you could take it if you'd like. Start anywhere. Or I can direct it. Roy, I'll pick. Key items. If you had your wish list, boy, I wish they always had these 3 or 4 things nailed down. What do you think those are?
Yeah, so it's variable, Steve, because we've worked with companies at various levels of maturity. In fact, I'll answer the question a little differently.
Okay.
And in some ways, I'll build off something Eric just said. Which is that the first thing that's critical for us is that there's a few people in our organization who really want this thing. In other words, almost regardless of what I think, I need a clinical champion. I generally need an executive sponsor. I generally need an operational driver, someone who will kind of do the day-to-day pushing as well. And so I'm trying to match our needs and our priorities with the things that we're seeing out there. And so a lot of what I know Todd and I do, and I think Eric too, is matchmaking. At the very beginning, there's a lot of matchmaking that goes on. In that process, what you need is highly responsive vendors. Guys and gals who are willing to be on site, who are willing to produce and respond to meetings and information requests extremely quickly. And you're generally looking for demonstration of evidence. And again, evidence changes over time. A lot of what we're doing is helping them generate validated evidence, but you're looking for some reason to believe that these are the right people to make a difference. So you're looking for a great team. You're looking for not the same old story in terms of technology, with some reason to believe that they're going to make a difference. I'm looking for what they've done with others. I'm looking for proof points. I'm looking for the speed with which they've tested whatever they've done to date. And then once you get into the actual interaction, there's a lot we can talk about, there, but it's kind of like we're looking for people who are also easy to work with. It's funny, there are understandably a lot of contracts go back and forth, and there's various issues that you have to deal with. But for pilots, you're trying to move as quickly as possible to generate evidence, and so you don't want folks who are redlining every sentence of a contract. In fact, you should pretty much be accepting it almost as is. It's a standard contract, things along those lines. Where even if you have, lawyers, for example, not to pick on lawyers who want to make sure that they've demonstrated adding some value, tend to mark a lot of things up. And we're saying, no, you want to get in and deploy quickly to start working with us. You don't want to get caught up in that. There's no kind of major potholes here that you have to worry about. So people who are easy to work with, obviously. And then, when you get into the actual deployment area, the way of working is critical. I mean, it's really amazing to me to see this difference between founders who really know how difficult and complex our settings are. Because, and they're here, they're on site, they're developing deep relationships with the clinicians, they're mapping out the different parts of the process. They're really looking for those things they need to learn to get it right, and understanding they may not know everything yet, and engaged as a member of that team with us deeply. And others who literally haven't even been here as things launched and something goes wrong and they're not around to catch it, react quickly to it, fix it. So the form of engaging is a really critical one. And I could keep going, but let me stop there. I know Todd is, and I've seen some of Todd's documentation, extremely rigorous about setting these up too. And I can talk more about setting them up as we get into it.
Okay, and you raised some interesting points. We'll come back to them. There's some things you brought up that are really interesting I want to dig into, but let's keep it. Todd, if you had your magic wand and a startup walked in and they want to be one of those 10 that you pick in 2 years, what have they nailed down in advance before they're coming to you in Salt Lake City at Intermountain?
I want them to have a good understanding of the impact of the workflow, especially if it's going to interact with a clinician. Do they understand the context of where their solution will be used and how? Another thing, and Roy mentioned this, I'm very curious. I often ask them the question, what do they want to learn? And sometimes they get blank stares. Other times they'll literally articulate the types of evidence that they believe that they need, whether it's workflow or whether it's, you name it. There are so many different items, but I'm curious to know if they have a learning plan. And the only reason that I ask that is I think one of the ingredients is that they have to remain curious. They don't need to feel like they have to have all of the answers, because part of the reason that we want to partner with early stage companies is to help shape and form their solution in a way that they can't do outside of the system. The other thing is I want them to understand their business model. What has to hold true for their company to actually be viable, and how can we help them learn whether or not that's the truth? And so if they've thought well through it, Roy mentioned the team. I've found often that if you have a clinician on the team who's an active clinician who works in the context and can have a really interesting dialogue with the clinical champion, like Roy mentioned, that you just can't do it without it. But someone on their team who can represent the clinical conversation, someone on their team who can represent maybe the operational conversation, it all ties back to me, though, Steve, to the learning plan. What do they really want to learn? What do they want to learn in 90 days or 60 days? And how would we structure a pilot around that for them, also while merging it with the things that we would want to learn or we're curious about with their team?
Okay.
So to build on that, Todd, that's a great point. From a large company perspective, understanding that our viewpoint that this is research and development, the reason why we're doing this is R&D, that we can't do ourselves. And while the early stage company, it's their life cycle and it's their lifeblood, for us, it's one aspect of what we do. So also to build on what Roy was saying, how to be easy to work with, I always equate that as be more of a silo. Don't tell me that you're going to come in and change workflow or processes across multiple departments and business units. That is the surest way to get it bogged down in legal and regulatory purgatory.
Okay.
Now, we don't have a clinician or a clinical angle like an Intermountain or a Penn, so we tend to stay more on the digital health side. But it is software. What pain are you solving is the other point. So Roy also mentioned they're called us matchmakers, and that's an excellent analogy. I need to quickly understand what pain in concept doesn't have to be proven out yet. And a lot of times we're fine being the first person you prove it out. Two, you don't have to have a long track record of doing it, but come to me with a clear understanding of what you're trying to solve. Why do I care? It's no different than venture capital. And when I ask that first question, what pain are you solving? And then have it be specific enough that I have a single business unit that I can go pitch and talk to, versus trying to disrupt and influence and get multiple parties aligned, because that will take like a year, if not longer.
Okay. Let's build on that, Eric, and let's stay with that. Let's say you have an entrepreneur, early stage digital health company comes to you and says, I'm thinking of running a pilot. Can you help us, maybe it's going to be at NHS Blue Cross, maybe it's going to be one of your partner hospitals. Could you help us through it? Maybe you'll fund it, maybe not.
Mhm.
From the moment they would talk to you and say, I'm thinking of running a trial, to they're running a trial, what's that timeline for the people that are watching this to set their expectations over under kind of thing? Now, what everybody's kind of smiling. What's the best case and what's the normal case from what you see?
Best case,
Companies are hungry. They're like, I need to run a trial and I need to do it fast.
right. Roy also articulated, I think Todd did as well, we have to have an executive sponsor.
Mhm.
So tongue in cheek, depends how high that executive sponsor is and
Okay.
they're already there. I've seen trials come to fruition 3 to 6 months. At best, I've seen folks work at this a year plus
Okay.
to navigate. If I need to bring it in and navigate the system, let's call it 9 to 12 months. And that's not to diminish how I can navigate the system. It's just calendaring and convincing and working within their day-to-day workflow and just trying to get them excited. If there is a C-suite or EVP that's really excited about it, it still needs to walk through, call it a 3 to 6 month process. So
Okay.
long story short, it's not a quick process for a large payer to get one of these done, but we're still excited and we want to do them.
Okay. So, it's important. If you're in an accelerator like Dream It or any other, there's many healthcare accelerators out there, and you're in a 4-month program, a 3-month program, even a 1-year program, it's best case 3 months. So, when you're then pitching at a demo day or a roadshow, at least you're saying, well, we're about to start a trial, but it's certainly not completed. You're just hoping to get it started.
Yeah, that's a great way to set expectations around
Okay.
what they look to get done in an accelerator.
Okay. Roy, what do you find?
It depends on a lot of factors. Again, we have ours that take 9 to 12 months too, to be perfectly clear.
Right.
We've had ones that have gotten in and deployed in a few weeks.
Wow, really? What's the
yeah.
magic? What happened in a few weeks?
There's a strong need. There was a clear fit. There had been a lot of good conversations early. There was, again, no friction in the process. In other words, everyone knew that the pilot contract was fairly meaningless. And it's not, I'm not posturing here to say, don't make me pay any money. Whether, for example, there's payment depends on the level of validation, the level of maturity. A lot of the pilots we do are free, we don't pay. Other pilots we do have tiny dollars to at least cover the costs of the vendor. And some pilots are paid pilots if there's already validation. That has to do with the role that we are playing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just sort of when I talked about sort of the legal contract and how much bickering there is around that, there's a lot of other things too that, for example, data ownership. There's a way to make this simple. To say, God, long term, I want to own this data and be able to prove all the cool things I can do. If you want to get into sort of data ownership and things like that, that's going to be a longer process.
Yep.
But we have had ones that were a clear fit, and it's an existing need, it's an existing priority, looking for a solution. The solution comes in. The team is mature, they're good to work with, they're highly responsive, they're not demanding in terms of the terms of the pilot.
Mm-hmm.
We've had ones that come in and actually get deployed within weeks.
Okay, I want to ask you one question, and then Todd, I want to come to you and ask that same kind of timeline. Just a couple of the points that you brought up, Roy. You said, look, if no money's changing hands, you're not getting the data. I think one of the big problems that a lot of entrepreneurs have, and early stage healthcare entrepreneurs, is you're going out, you're going on an investor roadshow, and you're running a pilot at Penn Medicine, and the VC says, well, how much did they pay you?
Sure.
Nothing.
Yeah, so a good VC.
What's that story? Yeah.
Yeah. A good VC knows that there are different partners, right? So a good VC is going to say, oh, you're working with Penn to validate. They're going to get that, right? But if you're already validated and it's all about, I'm trying to demonstrate my business model and that I can actually convert to paid, it's different. You can also come to even a validation partner or the partner you're trying to clinically, get some publishing going with, and have some conversations about if this works, what's next, right?
Okay.
So what would this be worth? Can we talk about sort of how good is good enough to turn this into a paying contract? And in fact, I will say that one of the failure points at pilots that too few people think about this big failure point at the end of pilots, without having been very clear about how good is good enough. What needle am I going to move for you? You get towards the end of the pilot, And everyone's sitting around going, that was great, wasn't it? And someone else is going, nah, not really, I don't know. And someone's saying, well, who budgeted for it? And someone else saying, nobody. Didn't you budget for it? No, I didn't budget for it.
Oh, wow.
So there's this need to say, how good is good enough? What needle do I need to move and how much? Who, the executive sponsor in theory, who's going to budget for that? Where's that money going to come from? That they say, oh yeah, you've moved this for me. And going back to things that Todd and Eric both talked about, it's not enough to just know your own business model and be clear about your own business model. You do need to know my business model or Eric's business model too. And this is a harsh reality, but it's true. We've had the best of the startups come in and teach us things about our business we didn't know. That there were certain ways to bill for their services that actually there was a value proposition from a healthcare perspective we didn't even know about because things are changing very rapidly right now. So you need to kind of understand if you expect Penn or Intermountain to pay, well, you better have a pretty darn good view of why it would be worth our paying. Where is that return and where is it going to show up? And
right.
Some are much harder to pay for right now based on the economics, than others. So
interesting. So Todd, somebody comes out and meets with you in Salt Lake City or gives you a call at Intermountain and says, I'd love to run a trial. What's the timeline look like for you?
Same. We haven't done one in weeks. Well.
Wait, in weeks? How frequently do you do? That's pretty cool.
Roy mentioned that he had one that they'd been able to, a few that.
Oh, I see what you mean by weeks. Yeah.
The fastest one I've seen is 3 months.
Okay.
But
I feel better now.
It was less invasive from a clinical workflow perspective. It was more about securing data. And then another one, we're starting a pilot with one week from today, and I've known those guys almost 2 years.
Wow.
But it's a device. It draws blood from a patient. And so it just depends on the continuum or where you are. The closer you get to the patient, the more complicated it becomes.
Okay. That device
so that's 3 months to a year and a half.
That device, though, that draws blood from a patient, were they talking to you 2 years ago about we'd like to run a trial, or was it just, kind of an exchange, dating before you get married, and then, a year ago they started talking to you about the trial, or has it been 2 years for trial?
No, they first came to us. They were extremely wise, actually. They came to us wanting to understand. They really did. Their team was so seasoned that the first thing we did was run data on blood draws for an entire year. We wanted to know how many sticks a patient was getting, how many blood draw errors we had. We did observational studies with them where we would go into ERs or other settings and literally do time and motion studies, interviews with clinicians. And so it was more of laying the groundwork of understanding first, because they were wise enough to know that this is much more complicated than just a device. We spent the first year doing that, and I'm actually the one who said, let's just do a pilot, because at some point we can talk like great speech, but what are you going to do now?
Right.
And so it took us, actually, we were the slow part, to be candid.
Okay.
But about a year into it, we said, hey, when are we going to pilot this? So about 6 months later, we'll start the pilot next Monday.
When you were going through that process, and they were meeting with people and interviewing clinicians and doing time motion studies, it wasn't really a pilot. Was it just more of a casual, hey, we'd like to do a meeting, and you'd help broker that and kind of set that up? Was there paperwork in place, or was it more informal, just collection and understanding?
No, it wasn't informal. I mean, like Roy mentioned, we're pretty rigorous around how we go about doing this. Anytime you get a startup in front of clinicians, especially the closer they get to patients, compliance, the antennas go up. But we were methodical. In the lab that I run, I have a few guys who are dedicated to just handling the day-to-day operations of it. I don't ask the clinical teams to do that. So we have someone who coordinates all of that, like a program manager.
Okay.
And we spend a lot of time interacting with a startup. Roy and I believe Eric mentioned, we want someone who's flexible, who can work around our crazy schedule, because you still have this conflict of the operating engine trying to suffocate the innovation engine, and how do you balance the two? And the flexibility of a startup to handle that and to be willing to understand is really helpful to getting things done.
Okay. For all three of you to transition a little bit, but it builds on something you just said, Todd. No, it's a little bit more formal than that. Are these companies, when they're coming in, is there investigational review board, IRB approval? Is there a principal investigator has to be assigned? Is it the full rigor for all three of you? Or we could start with you, Todd. Is that full level of rigor that these companies should expect to be dealing with?
Yeah, it's better to expect it and be pleasantly surprised when you don't have to do it.
Okay.
We always go to the IRB board just to make sure that it's okay to do what we propose doing.
Okay.
We've gotten passes actually on a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what we do, Steve, that may be a little bit different is that we do a proof of concept. And a lot of this I learned from Roy, frankly, to where we'll just run like a 3-week experiment and we test a couple of things that must hold true. So it's like, okay, what must hold true and then what's next? And if clinician satisfaction with the experience with the digital solution is key, we'll base it literally on something as simple as a net promoter score.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So is it like a pre-pilot? It's not a full pilot, it's like a baby pilot kind of thing?
Yeah, it's like a baby pilot, because if we can test the critical assumptions in just 3 or 4 weeks, then we can go into a pilot, and that is often where IRB will get more involved. But when we keep it very simple just to get the wheels rolling, because you can really get caught in the quagmire of over-designing your experiments early. So we try to design very simple ones that give us a little bit of a kitchen pass, and then we learn enough and we can go a little bit bigger and faster. One of your companies, I hope I can mention it, we did this with Tissue Analytics.
Okay.
We did a pilot in one wound care clinic. It lasted 3 weeks, and it took us a while to get to the 3 weeks. But once we learned that and the clinicians started inviting other clinicians into the dialogue, then we designed the pilot. And to what Roy said, we literally designed the conditions that would need to be met, and then we would pay for the pilot.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, we have these little key metric things we want to measure, and as long as we hit those generally, then we pay Tissue Analytics for the pilot. We didn't pay for the proof of concept, though.
Okay, and then one more thing, and we'll move it to some of the other people. When you did that pre-pilot, same level of rigor, contracts, BAA, data sharing agreements, or is it a little lighter touch to get that ball rolling?
It was a little lighter touch, but only in a couple of areas. Like with security, it was a little bit of a lighter touch because it was contained to one wound care clinic. It was contained to just a few devices. Then we went to 4 clinics in home care. It opened it up a bit more because you're going from having a patient's data for one wound care clinic to then having 150 patients and then 20 or 30 of those also being home care patients. So the visibility of that wound is across different settings and different devices. That was a little bit more difficult.
Okay.
But we typically can't get around some of the just have-tos, the BAAs, the data privacy things. Those are just table stakes here.
In healthcare, a little bit like different than other entrepreneurship, right? It's not always move fast and break things, and it's not always ask for forgiveness, not permission. It's healthcare. So, Eric, are you seeing the same type of thing when you're seeing companies that you've been involved with trialing? Is it full on, who's the IRB or the PI, HIPAA compliance, all of the regulatory type stuff for these early stage startups to get in and do trials? And I would assume it's a little different if they're trialing at Independence Blue Cross.
Yeah, the IRB is not so much what we look, but yeah, HIPAA compliance, BAA data, they need to be in place. And I've said this before a lot of times, and I'm guessing the startups are now rolling their eyes and going, oh God, I'm getting out of healthcare. Right. If they haven't figured it out by now. But a lot of times what happens if you download a musical app or a financial app and it doesn't work, no big deal. In healthcare, if you test something or you pilot something and it doesn't work, people get sick, people get sued, people die. And that's the level of risk that is around these type of innovative startups. So everyone else in our organization has their radar and their antenna up that they say, okay, I need all this documentation in place. I would love to be able to do a baby pilot and get it off the ground quickly. But to your point, Steve, I need to have a lot of the documentations and the I's dotted and the T's crossed before this gets started.
Do you guys, can I just ask, do you have a checklist that you give startups like you want to do it, or that you would expect the startup knows it? It's pretty standard stuff. For the dotting the I's and crossing the T's kind of thing.
I don't think they should know. I don't know about you, Eric or Roy, it's some of the things they can't know. So we try to tell them early. We will show them the checklist, and I'll get permission to share it with you guys so you can see all of the things that we go through.
That'd be great.
But back to what Eric was saying, this term of people talk about fail fast.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just me, but I really despise the term. It's about learning as quickly as you can, designing those learning experiments that will inform you of what the next one needs to be and the next one needs to be, because you can't think in terms of failure, especially in healthcare. It's just, it's a word that doesn't settle well.
Okay.
And so, what do you want to learn and learn it quickly? And to your point, Eric, they have to have patience. It does take longer in healthcare, much longer. But if you have a learning plan of quick ones, then it doesn't seem like such an arduous process, even if it takes a year, because you're learning in really quick increments along the entire year. It's not a big bang download type theory.
Well, that's a great point. And also, it isn't like their competitors are moving quicker than they are. A lot of times the reason people want to move quick in consumer tech or financial tech is because everyone else is innovative around them, and the fear of missing out or losing their first mover advantage. That isn't the case in healthcare. Everyone has to go through this glacial phase.
Yeah, I would say that, the thing that I think is interesting is, and where some of the creativity comes into play, is the application of methods that would say, well, how can we do this faster? How can we keep people safe and learn at a fast pace? And it's very linked to sort of the Paul Graham, do things that don't scale type of, article and approach, which is we can Band-Aid things in the short term to move faster. So here's sort of a partially true, partially made up story, to make the point. You're trying to test let's say a depression screening, app. And, lots of questions are going to come up around, well, what if somebody indicates that they're suicidal, you don't catch them in time, they leave and they commit suicide. So very severe, very, very serious situation. The startup may not have all the resources in place to deal with the immediate, okay, we caught someone here who is threatening self-harm imminently. And maybe the health system doesn't have that in place because they've never had this kind of real-time perfect screening. You're trying to do this, but maybe your instance of screening isn't as high as you want, and that's why you're doing the pilot. Well, there are longer and shorter, solutions to that. A shorter one might be, hey, I can hire an extra nurse or social worker and get them staffed on site at low volume to make sure that nobody leaves before we know that they didn't check this box. Now, that may not be a scalable solution, but what we're always trying to do is say, look, it's back to what Todd and Erica both said. It's like, what are the big assumptions you need to test? What must be true? And then what are the things that could go wrong? And how can you Band-Aid for them in a non-scalable way to move faster? And so we're always looking for that sort of non-scalable way to move faster if that's not the primary thing you're validating, right? So I'm with Todd. I don't really like the fail fast. I really, I use the term fail fast and cheap a lot, but what I really mean is validate fast and cheap, which is close to the learn, as fast and cheap as you can. And so, if the thing you're testing and learning is your efficient scalability, well, then you have to get past the do things that don't scale. But you're trying to get it right, and you're trying to get your initial clinical deployment, your initial clinical knowledge, test the workflow, test how different people in an office environment are interacting with the tool. You can use all kind of Band-Aids and all kind of fake, back ends to kind of, we often call concierge models. We will do a true concierge with lots of extra hands on deck to cover things that we know would otherwise take a long time. And so I'm trying to say, well, where can I apply extra hands and extra cost, additional cost, short term, to go faster, knowing I'm going to strip that away longer term.
Interesting. Okay, let me.
Let me make one comment. It's something Roy brought up. I don't know that I ever meet with a startup that I don't ask them this question: is it better to validate or invalidate an assumption? And most of them will say it's better to validate. It's like, I don't agree with you. If both of those are equally valuable, in the learning and the structure of your business. And so I say that just to encourage early stage companies that if you have an assumption and you ran an experiment and you invalidated it, that you were wrong, that's a good thing. That's a good thing for the health system. It's a good thing for you. And so don't let it discourage you that a health system will come back and teach you something that you just had no idea was right or wrong. And so both sides of that equation are very valuable in the shaping of a solution and even in the shaping of your business model.
Okay. Let's. I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
No, I was going to say it's a great point. I mean, I know he doesn't like neither Roy nor Todd like to fail fast, but I do say failure is an option, and I don't like the context of failure. But when we run into these entrepreneurs, they've been so high performing and perfectionist all of their career. So I do say failure is an option. It's just what did you learn from it? And how quickly can you learn from it?
Yeah. And I'll just say, so if I'm going to beat that dead horse, since the horse is already dead, but I'll keep beating it. I think at the beginning of the journey, you're not really asking, does this work? You're asking, how can I make it work? And so what I know, Eric and I have done this long enough together, and Todd and I have done this long enough together, that we're looking for people to not just learn fast, but change direction. And that's one of the things that we're selecting based on is how do you learn and how do you react to what you've learned and how quickly do you try again? I mean, are you engaged with us at a depth where we don't feel like we're just buying some off the shelf? It either works or it doesn't. This is it. Pilot can often mean fixed. I start here, I test it, I end here, and it either works or it doesn't. And for early stage companies, that's generally going to be failure, right? As opposed to, okay, what are we going to try this week? What are we going to try this week? What are we going to try this week? Because my goal is to find a way to make it work, not to test whether it does work. Later on down the line, once I think I have that in a decent place, now I'm holding things constant to do the more static version of validation.
So Roy, are you saying that if a pilot's going on and there's learning, there can be micro pivots during the pilot, slight course corrections week by week? And
I expect them. I expect people that, if you're early on, again, it all depends on the context you're in. If the context you're in is you're now running an RCT, even there you can have evolutionary designs where you're actually statistically controlling for new phases. So you don't have to hold things as constant as we used to. But in the early days, later days, it's going to be more static. It's going to be more constant because you're testing multiple arms to see if it really made the difference you think. But early on, it's okay. Here's V1 was last week, V2 is this week, V3 is next week, and every week I'm trying to say, well, what did you learn this week? What did and didn't work? What are you going to try next week? And I think that kind of cadence is sort of going to determine in this field what's really going to work well.
So Roy, I'll build on that, Roy. Or Todd, do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
So that was an example of what to do, and again, further beating this dead horse. Example, what not to do. I was mentoring a startup out of a different accelerator up in the Northeast, and they spent probably 6 weeks of the 10-week program or whatever it was, and it was a surgical center software company. So a little bit outside of a payer, but still talking to them. They spent 6 weeks trying to figure out their IP strategy and their go-to-market strategy, and they tried to get this absolutely perfect, when in fact they had 15 surgical centers in the surrounding area, and I asked them the simple question of, well, have you talked to anybody that they actually care about this? And it was like a little light bulb went on over their head and go, oh, we need to do that? So it was just around trying to echo Roy's point of frequent interactions with your large sponsor, health system, payer, et cetera. And just the sooner you get out there and talk and pivot and micro pivot, the better versus trying to have perfection is the enemy of progress.
Okay. All right, cool. I just wanted to, for those of you, if you don't know the 3-letter acronym TLA, Roy said if you're doing an RCT, a randomized clinical trial, in case you don't know that. I just wanted to move the conversation on a little bit. We have about 5 or so minutes and some things I wanted to hit. Roy and Todd, you both mentioned this in 2 different ways. When a startup's coming to you to run a trial, and Eric, I think I've heard you talk about this in the past, should they be having the pricing discussion with you before the trial starts, after the trial? What's your expectation, and what do you think what's your expectation? What's acceptable about pricing, and when to talk about it? It's
situational. For us, it's situational. It's actually, I'm interested in hearing Todd's answer because I don't think Todd is one of the ones you and I have ever talked about. Again, if they're pre-validation, if they haven't gotten sort of published results yet, yeah, I would not be expecting to have much of a pricing conversation, because at least at Penn, and this is not true of every leading system, we're unlikely nowadays to pay if there's no evidence that it works. It could be the best idea. It's like, but look at my beautiful baby. Look at this incredible thing I've built. How could you not want to pay? It's like, well, I'm sure it is beautiful, but we don't have any validation of that yet. So that's just not the way we do things. And I will say, in fact, when I'm advising companies, sometimes I will tell them to go find health systems not like Penn, who will pay, for that. And there's not sort of only one way to do it. And you'll find out there, when you go to a lot of different, all leading systems, very different willingness to pay based on the amount of evidence you have. Mm-hmm. If you already have some good validated evidence and there's a reason to believe we're going to have that ROI, and Todd talked a lot about business model and helped me think through the mechanics here of, how am I going to see a benefit? What benefit am I going to see? Often we do say, well, look, if you do this, well, then there could be payment attached to it. If I achieve the following things, I'm certainly willing to pay, because there really is value for that. And on top of that, I think I mentioned this briefly before, I certainly think it's okay and preferable and good to, even if you're not paying me for the pilot, to be having conversations with the folks who understand the economics in the health system, talk about what the value would be if we achieve a certain thing. How would that change our life, our system, and start to develop that business model to the extent it's not already developed.
So Roy, just to drill down, and then Todd, I'd like to ask you the same question. If I'm an early stage entrepreneur and I'm going to run a trial, are you saying it's out of bounds for me to say, Roy, look, if this works, I know we don't have evidence yet, and thank you, that we're going to go through this pilot. Is this something that Penn Medicine would be willing to pay $20,000 per month or $5 per month per patient per month? Can I not even ask that to just?
No, you can. You can absolutely have that conversation, and I think that's what I was trying to say, is that you can. Okay. What you want to do is you want to have this conversation around value capture. Let's work out this model of, look, here's what we think we're changing. We think we are getting rid of these readmissions. We think we are lowering this infection rate. We think we are increasing this care staying within the system. And if we do it at this level, at this volume, here's how that converts to money. Here's what we believe it's worth. Here's what we, the entrepreneurs, believe it's worth. Is that right? Does that make sense? When you show it to your finance guys, your department chairs, your chief operating officers, is this a priority for them? Is this something they've been tasked to do? Is this something they can bake into the budget and say, oh yeah, there's a return here that we can understand, so of course we'd be willing to pay. So I think it's a good conversation to have. And all I was trying to say before is, if you're waiting to get paid to do it and you don't have any evidence, you're going to have a hard time, at least at Penn.
Got it. Todd, how about Intermountain? Pricing discussion before I'm even running my pilot, is that inbounds, out of bounds?
It's inbounds in the same context that Roy spoke about.
Okay.
I think one of the things that startups don't understand is that it actually costs us a lot of money to do a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If we're working with affiliate physicians or nursing time, then my budget often has to fund that time, because in the P&Ls and the GLs of the hospitals or the clinics, they don't have money set aside in their normal budgeting cycles to say pay for $20,000 of clinician time. They just don't.
Okay.
So I think it's one of the things that startups fail to understand, is that if I have a project manager dedicated 20 hours a week to your project for 6 months and a doctor 4 hours a week, that we actually are expending a lot of time and money to work with you. And to Roy's point, I like to have the conversation around pricing to see how they're thinking about it, what their assumptions behind it are. And Roy gave me this term back in 2009 or 10 called a love metric. And, so I asked
this is the PG-13 broadcast, but
yeah. So I asked them, if we're going to hire your solution, what's the one thing that you believe we would love for it to do for us?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know what they think. And then if they say, okay, it will reduce readmissions, then it just allows a different line of questioning to ask them, so how have you instrumented your solution to be able to prove to us that it actually moved that needle? How do you isolate it in a way? And how would we structure a pilot to help start proving that? And then we can come to some type of agreement that at the end of the at the end of the pilot, maybe if we've moved some of those needles or at least early indicators, that if the startup's hurting for money, maybe we can actually pay for one. We've done that in a couple of cases where we knew it would be really beneficial to pay for their travel out to see us or to pay for, I don't know, just some other little things they had to do. But initially, no. Talk about pricing to learn versus pricing to get a check.
Depending on the system, right? I mean, because if the system is, if the goal of Intermountain or the goal of Penn is to get some validation studies, then you might need us as much as we need you. If the goal is to build a customer base, then talk pricing and make sales. I mean, again, I said this briefly before, different systems are good for different things. Penn is not a great place to make fast sales early on. We're great for validation, we're great for research, we're great for publishing and broad distribution of, establishing you as a leader, the startup as a leader. Intermountain is extremely well respected in the same way, internationally known as a rigorous place that does the measurement and evaluation. But there are other systems out there that I will point my own companies to as an angel investor, as an advisor, where they can move faster and get paid faster, frankly, than one of the big academic, systems.
Let me goes back, Roy, to the question that they need to know why they want to do a pilot.
Yeah.
They really need, what's the purpose of their pilot? Is it validation? Is it to get our name in a press release with them because it's already proven that it's well enough and they're just wanting to build some momentum to get UPenn and Intermountain to do a press release within the same quarter? You really have to be focused very early. And that's often hard for a startup because they want to boil the ocean, and not so easy in healthcare to do that. So be very purposeful around why you're going to pick UPenn or Blue Cross or Intermountain or Stanford, whomever, but know why you want to work with them.
And I will say, yes, Steve, so we also pay for costs. We also recognize that startups are have cash constraint. So we often will pay for costs. We push hard.
Wait, you're paying the startup money, or
we'll pay costs? These are small dollars. These are not dollars that's going to make any VC who's looking for big contracts happy. But we certainly will pay something. But we're pushing hard for SBIR funding. This is obviously where other funding comes into play to support these. And to the point on love metrics, that Todd brought up, I think a lot of people have read Eric Ries. They've heard about vanity metrics. So love metrics are simply the opposite of vanity metrics, right? So in the early days, most innovation fails because you scale prematurely, right? And so when you're looking at revenue and profit and number of customers served, you're not going to do very well because this is all about getting it right first. So you want the metrics that are all about getting it right before you make it big. And so Todd and I and Eric, we all look at, show me the get it right metrics. If you're working on infection rate, show me that you change the infection rate. If you're working on readmission, show me you change readmissions. And they're more complicated than that because it's reuse, not just use. I can get anyone to use anything. Do they keep using it? Do they recommend it? To Todd's point around word of mouth, does it achieve that ends? And then one of the love metrics is around economics, but it's not the amount, it's not the volume of economics. It's can I capture any of the value I create, which is a different way to think about it than sort of the amount of revenue or customers.
Got it. Eric, I wanted to come back to you, and we have just about 2 or 3 minutes left because I already have a queue of questions from some people in advance, and there's a lot of people that are listening in right now, and I wanted to see if we had a minute or two to get to their questions. I wanted to wrap up with this thought and start with you, Eric. Tricks and traps. From everything we've already talked about, are there things that you could think to add in 2 or 3 tricks or traps where you've seen startups just get waffled doing a pilot or trial? If there's 1 or 2 things you could share that we haven't already talked about, and if you're not ready and somebody else knows, we can flip, but these are the things to keep in mind. Anything jump to mind that we haven't already talked about?
Yeah, the reality is I think we've touched on a lot of them. Just to quickly summarize, how big is the pain? Why do I care? And recall what we're in this for. It's R&D for us. It's validation. It's proving out an idea. So even though we may not pay for it or we'll pay the cost, to Roy's point, the startup is getting validation in terms of market credibility and its assumptions getting validated. So there is value there. But I think we touched on most of them.
Okay. Todd, two or three or one that we haven't already talked about, the most critical, you're an early stage healthcare entrepreneur, one or two tricks or traps that you really want to do or don't want to do that we haven't already talked about?
Don't assume you know the answers. I've met with a few startups that always had an answer to the question and didn't come prepared with a mindset of curiosity because they're not ready to scale. To Roy's point, they're still in learning mode. So remain very curious. One of the tricks, I think, is to actually come in as if you're coming to an interview, because you are. Come in with what you want to learn. Come in with what you know about your business and what you don't know about your business. And I know it's hard to know what you don't know, but you can sit and be curious enough and come in asking a lot of questions versus just trying to pitch and sell. Some of the best startups I've seen came in and said, this is what we have, but we know we don't have it nailed yet. What do you think we're missing? And then, because I don't know about the rest of the systems, but I believe this about UPenn and others. When we decide to work with you, we want to help you. You don't need to look like the smartest person in the room because we're there to partner with you and help push your solution forward because it's going to help us as well. So look at it as a partnership versus this binary exchange of money for time or time for money, and work with us in a dialogue that way. I think that for me has been the most fun when we're working with a startup, is that they remain curious and they want to continue to learn. But don't come thinking that you have all the answers, because it turns clinicians off very quickly when you just assume that you know what they will do or what they do in the context of care.
It's a great point.
Interesting. Roy, any other, one or two critical tricks or traps that have been talked about? Or again, the traps where you've seen startups get waffled.
Yeah.
Or trial or tricks that
I'm going to repeat two that I already said, Steve, just for emphasis. One is be real clear about clinical champion, and I really emphasis on the champion. It's not enough to find someone willing to work with you. You have to find someone who wants you, who's pulling. Like if you feel like you're pushing, it's a very different feeling than if they're pulling. And you want someone who's pulling, because you have limited resources, you have limited time. You've got to have an engaged partner on the other side. And Todd or Eric and I sometimes can ask people to work with a startup, and sometimes they'll say yes just to try to make us happy or whatnot. Very, very different than someone who's like, yeah, this is a top priority for me to get right, and I really need to get and want to get this right. So emphasis on the champion part of the champion. But on the metrics side, be really, really clear on, you could go back to the love metrics conversation, you could go back to the how good is good enough conversation, or the don't get to the end of the pilot without knowing conversation. But when the focus is on nailing it, you stop thinking about, does my product or service do what I promised? Because that's really not what we care about a lot of times. It's more, did it achieve the outcome that we need? Right? So you may say, well, I'm delivering the messages I said I was going to deliver, and I'm getting the patient engagement that I told you I'd get. And, Todd and Eric and I would probably all say, so what? To what end? Right? What has changed in my world? Has that engagement led to the change that we need? Because it should evolve and change the way you think of your service. You should not be thinking of your service as a functional thing. Does it do these things functionally? Does it achieve these functional requirements? Does it do that better than anyone else? That's all great, but that's foundational only, because we're all looking in terms of, did it move the needle? Did it achieve the outcome? Is the world now different because of that? And so that conversation of how good is good enough and the love metrics piece is absolutely essential for the teams to have their head wrapped around.
Okay, cool. Guys, I have a few questions that were already sent in advance. Let me just read them into the conversation, and I'll say who they're from, and I'll just read them aloud. So Rich Polaria, who's at a company called Kermit, Physician Preference Items. So it's a company that specializes in hip replacements, that thing, and type of thing, and making sure that hospitals are getting their agreed upon contracts when surgeons are putting these in. He asks to Roy, I guess, what type of language does the service or product provider craft to obligate the customer to a next step? I think well, you're going to have to answer it, not me, but this was written before we even had the conversation. So he said, we use a proof of concept document, but the language isn't legally binding, And to do so seems over the top to try to have, where he's trying to have something in place.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I will say that we will never agree to legally binding language because the whole point of the pilot is to learn. So, in fact, one of the things that would massively slow down the pilot is to get to agreed upon language about what happens next. I would personally not recommend that. I try to get into the pilot faster and just deal with the pilot. What I have seen work well is sort of that agreed upon success metrics, that they're not binding, but you're having the conversation. In other words, hey, we believe we can, to Rich and Kova's point, we believe we're going to find X% of costs you didn't know about, or be able to eliminate this many costs, or, as we work with this many physicians or this many procedures, we think we're going to find an incidence of waste in at least this many of them. Something that is indicative that we're thinking about it the same way. What they think they can achieve is what we want, and that we're watching the same needles, and that we're defining success the same way. I've seen non-legally binding versions of that. Frankly, if the startup delivers, even if they fall short of delivering, but they've worked in a highly collaborative and engaging way with us in a sort of doing the right thing, those are the guys who get the paid contract going forward, right? It's like, oh, we set the needle here and you got here, you missed it by, a few percentage points. That doesn't mean you're not going to get the contract. It means that we were working towards the same thing together. So being explicit is good. Trying to make it legally binding up front, I'm not like the world's expert. It's not. I couldn't say no one's ever done that, but I've never seen that at Penn. I've never seen that work at Penn.
Okay. Let me just a couple more questions. If we go about 3 minutes over, and then we'll wrap it. I show it's about noon Eastern time. Are you guys okay for 5 more minutes max, and then we'll wrap it up? Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Vitter, who is a co-founder of Keratin. So they're making a product, Lactalog, for neonatal ICU and breast milk issues for premature babies and their moms. So he wrote and asked, how long with how many participants should a pilot be conducted to gather sufficient results for an evidence-based trial? Now, during this conversation, I heard one of you, it may have been Todd, if you're running a trial for 3 to 6 months, or it might have been 2 to 4 months. What do you think that, I guess his question was, how many people and how long a time frame? What are your thoughts from any of you? What's that time frame to actually run the pilot?
It really depends on what you need to learn, right? I mean, if you need to do something for FDA clearance, it's going to be totally different, obviously, than do people take this action I need those people to take. I think I want to make sure that my co-panelist answer. My quick answer is, well, on one hand, I could say there's no answer. On the other hand, when you do qualitative work and you're hitting, let's say, for most things, and it's a very hard thing to answer because it's so different, whether it's a surgical procedure or a patient communication thing. They're each a little different. But honestly, the strange thing that qualitative research has learned is that if you're getting thematic saturation, in the 30 and 40, patients, let's say, or members, Derek, you can start to believe what you're seeing around thematic saturation, at that 30, 40, 50 level. Of course, it's so all over the map because some things, you may be working in an area where there only is 1 patient a month, which is going to be a hard thing for you to do, right? Or an area where I'm dealing with all 3 million of my patients, and I'm going to try to get 200 through the door every week. So it is a huge, it depends, but I will say that you can generally see thematic saturation 30, 40, 50.
Okay. Todd, what your experience? With the length of the trial, how big the trial?
When you're specifically thinking like a therapeutic, like was mentioned, we have an office of research.
Mm-hmm.
I go to them to ask that question.
Okay.
I try to stay away from that. And it goes back to what Eric and Roy have said. What are you really trying to learn? What would good evidence look like for you from a pilot perspective? If you're trying to get enough proof and you're interacting with the FDA, a little different, a little more difficult.
Right.
We're about to run one now that's not really after the FDA, and our patient set is 25.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
And I want to emphasize one thing Todd just said. If you're trying to prove statistical differences, you know, and you're going to do that for publication. I do the exact same thing Todd does, which is I go to a researcher, I go to a statistician, and I look at, gee, you know, how many people would we need to establish a difference between these two things? And often it can be hundreds. You know, if I think I can pick up a X% difference or a Y% difference, I'm going to need a different number. But that's a purely math answer. You know, math can give you the answer, and a statistician can give it. I was answering more from the perspective of I need a pilot to generate some evidence to move to a next step with the organization. But otherwise, it is all over the map.
Okay. Eric, let me, if you don't mind, I want to change the question because there was another question very specifically for you, and then we're almost out of time. And this again was from Vitter at Keratin, and I'm going to read it and hopefully make sense. You know, he asked, how do startups bill via CPT code? So this was for you, right? Meaning, he said, I vaguely understand we need to run trials and then apply for appropriate CPT code for approval, but it would be great to hear this from you, that whole process. Like, are they billing a CPT code during a trial? Or how does that process, when would they be able to bill against the CPT code, I guess is his question. And then we'll wrap it up.
It's a great question that I'm not going to be able to give a really good answer for because reimbursement is not my specialty.
Okay.
My understanding, and just in terms of expectations for startups, we tend to follow, or we do follow CMS. So if something falls within a CPT code that CMS has established, then you can try to bill for it because there's already one in place. We're not going to come up and try to come up with a CPT code to fit you in. So this goes back to know our own business maybe better than we do, and Roy touched on it all the way in the beginning. And I was just talking with someone, they're like, hey, there's a CPT code. I asked our reimbursement folks, and they're like, yeah, kind of, not really. It's an old one that's not actively billed. So all I can say is if there's one already established, you could try, and that's one way to gain payment during the pilot. But I'll go back to what Todd said. It's less around payment during a pilot and more about what you're trying to find out and prove. We'll figure out economics after it's been validated. Does that make sense?
Yep. Awesome. Guys, let me do this. It's 5 minutes after the hour. We're already late, and I know everybody is very, very busy. For those that are listening, and I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to open up for questions. We just don't have time. I appreciate the questions we got in advance, and we'll start doing these weekly so we can get those questions, not this particular panel. You know, we've been talking today, you know, to Todd Dunn in innovation at Intermountain Health in Salt Lake City, Roy in Philadelphia at Penn Medicine, and Eric at Independence Blue Cross in Philadelphia as well, about how to pilot healthcare solutions. And I just want to say thank you. I mean, when I was an early stage, when I was doing my first entrepreneurial thing, I wish there were people just pouring out pure gold. I mean, the advice that you're giving today is just awesome. It's rich in tricks and traps and pragmatics. And I know I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure the audience that's going to listening in live and will listen in the future will get a lot out of it. I just want to thank all of you. I know you're all extremely busy. Thanks for fitting in. And if you had any closing remarks you want to say or anything, we could do that. Otherwise, it was just awesome, and I really appreciate your time.
Maybe I'll have one quick one, which is, you know, we talked a lot about the not getting paid, and all three of us said that, but, you know, we also, I think, you know, have been around startups long enough time. We know how important it is to get paid. You're always trying to find a way to get paid. I don't think any of our comments are about not doing that. You know, so finding alternate business models, trying to go, you know, direct consumer pay, looking for self-insured employers who will pay, like finding ways to get paid is essential. The real point I think that three of us are making is be really clear about why you're using the health system you're using. You should always be working towards payment. In this class of Dream, we have some more mature companies who have more validation, who are further along, who actually could, for the first time, be talking about, hey, you know what, here's what we can do, here's what we've already done. We think we should be paid for this. And that's a conversation you can have and push it. You know, we might look at it and say we don't believe the evidence, we don't think it's strong enough, but we might look at it and say, wow, you know, you're a solution to a problem we need to solve and something we need to fix. So yeah, don't stay away from the revenue thing. It's just, you know, I think our message was be really clear on what you need to learn and why you're using us versus other elements of the ecosystem and other doors you're trying to open.
But I'll echo that real quick, Roy. It's also expectation setting in terms of timing. If we're looking for payments or a large sums that will extend and elongate the discussion period before entering into a pilot. It's just expectation setting. But you're right, I have seen pilots get paid.
Cool. Todd, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think the root of most great innovations is empathy, candidly. And as a startup, health systems, we know that we're not perfect. I don't know that it's productive to remind us too blatantly that we're not. But to empathetically remember that clinicians and the people who are taking care of patients are honestly doing their absolute best. And to come to that mindset that you're here to help us do a better job of keeping people healthy versus trying to point out blatantly that we're so wrong. Frame it in a way that, you know, you're empathetic and you're curious and you also want to improve the care and the lives of people. I just think that's a great posture, specifically in this industry compared to some of the other ones that I've been in. And then that just will endear you to the system, and they'll want to help you even more when they know that you're there to be a partner in the improvement of healthcare.
Awesome. Thanks. Oh, was somebody going to say something?
Yeah.
I like that.
Okay.
Great
Awesome.
point, Todd.
Guys,
The ability to listen.
Yes. I also just want to thank again. So this cycle of Dream It Health in Philadelphia is sponsored by Independence Blue Cross and Penn Medicine. Eric and Roy, we greatly appreciate your sponsorship. Also, Blackstone gave a very nice grant for this cycle. It's why Dream It Health is doing so many companies this cycle, more than we've ever done before, because Blackstone wanted to see the Penn Independence program get even bigger. So we appreciate that. Todd, thank you for joining in. It was great. I know Roy and you think very highly of each other and have done this for years and years. And I appreciate everybody's time today. I think we're going to end it at this point. Thank you. We had a lot of people, participants, and I'm sorry we can't take calls or questions, but I appreciate everybody's time today. Thanks so much.